It was a crisp fall evening when liberal journalist Emily Hartford found herself on the stage at the National Press Club. She had been invited to give a speech on the growing influence of the Trump family in American politics, a subject she had grown passionate about after years of reporting on the family's rise to prominence. The audience was a mix of seasoned political analysts, reporters, and a few politicians. Emily, known for her sharp tongue and unapologetic stance on most issues, felt a strange satisfaction as she prepared to speak. As she took the microphone, her eyes briefly scanned the crowd before she began. "You know," Emily began, her voice dripping with irony, "there's one member of the Trump family who seems to have managed to stay out of the spotlight for years. But I can't help but wonder if that's not for long." The crowd shifted slightly, intrigued by what Emily was about to say next. "You see, Barron Trump, the youngest son of Donald Trump, has somehow remained almost entirely invisible in the media. But don't be fooled, just like his father, he is a product of a legacy of privilege and power. In fact, I'd bet that if he ever had the courage to step into the public eye, he'd have no problem fitting into the mold of his father's business empire." There was a sharp pause. Emily smiled to herself, sensing that her words would ignite a response. The audience buzzed, some murmuring in agreement, others in discomfort. Then, without missing a beat, she continued. "Perhaps one day, Barron will follow in his father's footsteps. Maybe he'll even become the next Trump to hold office, and God help us all." As her words echoed through the room, Emily felt a sense of triumph. She had made her point clear. It was a bold jab, aimed at a family she felt had done nothing but fuel political division and chaos. What she didn't expect was what came next. The moment Emily Hartford finished her speech, the room erupted into a mix of murmurs and applause, though it was clear that not everyone was pleased with her words. She had made her mark, but something inside her stirred, a feeling that she had just crossed a line. She took her seat, feeling the eyes of the room on her, wondering if the media would pick up on her comments. What she hadn't anticipated was the sudden disruption. A young man, his face partially hidden behind a sharp suit, stood up from the back of the room, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "I think I should respond to that," the man said calmly, almost as if he'd been expecting to be called upon. Emily blinked in surprise. Who was this? The young man stepped forward, the crowd parting slightly to make room for him. He was tall, but there was an undeniable calm about him that belied his age. His expression was composed, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet confidence. "I'm Barron Trump," he announced, his voice echoing through the room, sending a wave of shock over the audience. For a moment, there was dead silence. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting any number of responses, but not this one. Barron Trump, the very person she had so pointedly mocked, was standing in front of her, looking unfazed and composed. For a moment, she thought about dismissing him. This could be some kind of stunt, right? But the sincerity in his eyes made it impossible to write him off. And then he spoke again, his voice steady but carrying an unexpected weight. "I've heard plenty of things about myself, but I believe in something my father always taught me: you can't be defined by others. You don't have to answer to people who don't know you, who don't know your story." He paused, his gaze now sweeping over the crowd. "So, while I respect your right to criticize, I'll tell you this: your assumptions are wrong, and the narrative you've built around me is just that, a narrative." The crowd was silent, their attention now fully on Barron, whose composed stance contrasted sharply with the venom in Emily's words just moments before. Emily could feel her pulse quicken. She had made the mistake of thinking Barron was just a child, a byproduct of his father's fame, but here he was, speaking with the kind of maturity she hadn't anticipated. Barron took a breath, then added, "I've always been more than just my family name. And when the time comes, I'll show the world who I really am. But for now, I'm not interested in the spotlight. I'm not interested in playing into anyone's expectations." As he finished, the room sat in stunned silence. The effect of his words was undeniable. The young man, once considered an afterthought by many, had just delivered a message that resonated deeply with everyone in the room. Emily felt a pang of something, a mix of humiliation and unexpected respect. She had underestimated Barron Trump. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes, the person you least expect to rise up can do so in the most astonishing way. The silence in the room lingered like a thick fog. Barron Trump stood there, unwavering, his posture perfect, and his words still echoing in everyone's mind. For a moment, it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the space. No one knew how to react. Emily Hartford, for the first time in a long time, was at a loss for words. Barron glanced once more at the crowd before turning his gaze back to her. "I don't need to engage in a battle with someone whose mind is already made up. But maybe one day you'll realize that a person's worth isn't defined by the title they're born into, but by what they choose to make of themselves." With that, he turned and calmly walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing as the door clicked shut behind him. The room was left in stunned silence, the tension palpable. Emily, still recovering from the shock of his unexpected reply, sat frozen in her chair. She hadn't expected Barron to respond, let alone with such poise. Her entire carefully constructed narrative had been dismantled in mere moments. She had painted him as a figure of privilege, of entitlement, and yet here he was, speaking with a level of humility and conviction that many adults, including herself, would envy. The press conference continued, but it was clear the tone had shifted. The media in the room were no longer paying attention to her speech, they were all now focused on Barron's unexpected appearance and what he had said. Emily's phone buzzed non-stop with notifications. Tweets, texts, and messages flooded in, many questioning her approach and criticizing her for the harshness of her remarks. It wasn't just Barron's response that shocked the world, it was the way he handled himself, how he took something as personal and hurtful as her words and turned it into an opportunity for reflection and growth. Later that night, Emily sat alone in her office, rereading Barron's words. A small part of her still felt the need to justify herself, to claim that she was simply doing her job as a journalist. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had crossed a line. And now the world was watching as Barron Trump had become something she never thought possible, a symbol of quiet strength and dignity in the face of public scorn. The story took on a life of its own. The next day, headlines exploded across news outlets. Barron Trump responds to criticism with poise and strength. Liberal reporters' words backfire as Barron Trump shocks nation with powerful reply. Trump's youngest son defies expectations in stunning public response. The story spread like wildfire, sparking debates on social media. Some praised Barron for his maturity, while others continued to criticize him for his family's politics. But one thing was clear, he had made his mark. And for the first time in years, Barron Trump was no longer just Donald Trump's son. He had become his own person, capable of shaping the narrative on his own terms. Emily, for all her success as a journalist, was now faced with an uncomfortable reality. Barron had outmaneuvered her, not with anger or retaliation, but with a quiet grace that spoke volumes. The next time Emily stepped onto a stage to speak, she couldn't help but think of Barron's words. They lingered in her mind, challenging her to reconsider the judgments she had so freely passed on others. Maybe, just maybe, the world had underestimated him. In the days that followed Barron Trump's unexpected appearance, the media landscape shifted. While many outlets continued to debate the political ramifications of his response, some were more focused on the personal aspect of what had just happened. It wasn't just about Barron's relationship to his father, nor was it merely the insult hurled by Emily Hartford. It had become a story about identity, resilience, and perception, how easily we can create narratives about people without ever truly knowing who they are. Emily's reputation took a hit. Journalists and critics who had once lauded her as a fearless truth-teller now questioned her approach. Her inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, others condemning her as a bully. But it wasn't the public outcry that hurt the most, it was the quiet reflection she found herself trapped in. She spent hours each day rethinking her career, her motivations, and what it meant to be a journalist. It wasn't just Barron's words that lingered in her mind, it was the image of him standing there, so composed, so unflinching. It made her question her own practices. Was she, too, just creating narratives for the sake of a good story? Had she overlooked the humanity of those she reported on? One evening, after a particularly restless day, Emily sat down at her desk, the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. She stared at her computer screen, the cursor blinking at the beginning of a new article she had planned to write. It was supposed to be a follow-up on the incident with Barron Trump, a chance to defend her side of the story, to explain why she had said what she had. But as she sat there, her fingers hovering over the keys, she realized that she couldn't write it. Not now. Not like this. For the first time in years, Emily Hartford was at a crossroads. The piece she had planned wasn't just another story, it was a reflection of everything she had come to stand for. She couldn't bring herself to write a defense, not after hearing Barron's words. In that brief exchange, he had done more than just respond to an insult, he had called for a re-evaluation of how we perceive others, especially those who live their lives under the public microscope. Emily sat back in her chair, the weight of it all sinking in. She didn't know what the future held for her, but she knew one thing for certain, she could no longer report from a place of judgment. She had to find a way to tell stories without adding to the noise, without assuming that she knew everything about the people she covered. Days later, Emily found herself in a rare moment of self-doubt, but also of clarity. She began to rethink how she could engage with people in her reporting. Perhaps, for the first time, she could look beyond the public persona, beyond the image that was often constructed by the media, and instead focus on the complexities of individuals. That was the real story, the story of people, not just their names and faces. And if she had learned anything from Barron Trump, it was that every person, no matter how famous or notorious, deserved the space to define themselves. Perhaps, in the end, Barron had taught her more about journalism than she had ever expected. Months later, when Emily finally did write again, it wasn't with the sharpness or arrogance of her past work. It was with a newfound respect for the people behind the headlines, and the quiet strength they often displayed in the most unexpected ways. And Barron Trump? Well, he remained mostly out of the public eye, just as he had wanted. But in the silence, in the absence of the constant media scrutiny, his message lived on, shaping not only his own future but also the way journalists like Emily Hartford would tell stories from then on. Months passed, and the media cycle moved on. Barron Trump remained largely out of the public eye, his quiet yet profound response to Emily Hartford's insult fading into the background of an ever-changing news landscape. But the impact of that moment lingered, subtly reshaping the way people thought about public figures, and even more so about the young man himself. Emily Hartford, now more reflective than ever, found herself grappling with the long-term consequences of her actions. In the wake of the incident, she had become somewhat of a symbol, a cautionary tale in the world of journalism about the dangers of making assumptions. People who had once admired her sharp, no-holds-barred approach now questioned her ethics. The response from the public was mixed. Some believed she was being unfairly criticized, while others insisted that her words had been unnecessarily cruel. But Emily, for the first time in her career, stopped caring about what others thought. Instead, she began to focus on something more important, the pursuit of truth. Not the sensational headlines or the dramatic stories that drove clicks, but the kind of truth that came from understanding and empathy. She started to slowly rebuild her career, writing thoughtful pieces about the dangers of oversimplified narratives and how often people, especially those in the spotlight, were misjudged or misunderstood. Barron Trump's response had shifted something deep within her, and it wasn't just a single lesson in humility. It was a shift in the way she saw her role as a journalist. She realized she didn't just have the power to write stories. She had the responsibility to ensure that those stories were honest, nuanced, and reflective of the full spectrum of the people involved. One day, months after Barron's public reply, Emily received an unexpected email. It wasn't from Barron, of course, but from a source who had followed up on the aftermath of the incident. It was an invitation to speak at a panel on political media ethics, focusing on the evolving nature of how the media treats public figures, especially the children of politicians. As she read the email, Emily thought about Barron again. She remembered the calm confidence with which he had spoken that day at the press conference, how he had refrained from retaliating, instead choosing to challenge the entire narrative that had been built around him. The invitation was a turning point. Emily accepted the invitation, knowing it would be an opportunity to contribute to an ongoing conversation about responsibility in the media. As she prepared for the panel, she found herself reflecting on what she had learned, not just from Barron, but from the entire experience. There were moments of vulnerability in everyone, even those who appeared untouchable, and her role was not to expose or tear them down, but to help others understand them. At the panel, Emily shared her journey, acknowledging her past mistakes and how her perspective had evolved. She spoke about Barron Trump without malice, without bias, focusing on the maturity and resilience he had shown in the face of public criticism. She emphasized the importance of seeing beyond the labels we place on people and recognizing their complexity. The room listened intently, the air thick with the tension of a story that had unfolded in real time. Emily had come full circle. She was no longer the journalist who had attacked Barron Trump with cutting remarks. She was a journalist who had learned, painfully at first, how to grow from the experience and how to understand her own role in shaping narratives. Meanwhile, Barron remained largely silent, still navigating his own path, away from the media circus. Yet his brief words in that moment of public exposure had cast a long shadow. They had not only impacted Emily but had become a quiet, yet powerful force that reminded others that the power to define oneself could never truly be taken away. The legacy of that day was not just about Barron's response, it was about the shift in how people thought about media, about power, and about the very nature of public life. It was about the understanding that, at the end of the day, everyone deserves a chance to be seen for who they truly are, not just who the world thinks they should be. Years passed, but the moment when Barron Trump had unexpectedly stood up and delivered his measured response continued to resonate, not just for Emily Hartford but for a larger, more societal shift. It had ignited a subtle yet powerful movement that questioned the ethics of journalism, particularly when it came to children of politicians, those who had no say in the stories written about them, but whose lives were often put on display for public consumption. As Emily continued to navigate the delicate balance of responsible journalism, she found herself more attuned to the nuances of her profession. She worked tirelessly to write pieces that didn't simply seek to stir the pot but aimed to foster a deeper understanding. The lessons Barron had inadvertently taught her weren't just about humility, they were about recognizing the human element in every story, even the ones involving the most polarizing figures. One afternoon, Emily received a letter that caught her completely off guard. The envelope, written in elegant, simple handwriting, was addressed to her. As she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. Inside was a letter from Barron himself. Dear Ms. Hartford, I hope this letter finds you well. I don't know if you remember, but years ago, I had the opportunity to speak at a press conference where you made some comments about me. I've followed your career since then, and I want to thank you for how you've responded to that moment. Your reflection and growth over the years have not gone unnoticed. It was unexpected for me, but I believe in the power of learning from our mistakes, and you've done just that. In many ways, your story is a reminder that we're all capable of change. I'm not looking for praise or recognition. I simply wanted to say thank you. The way you've evolved as a journalist is something that can't be easily quantified, but I see it, and it matters. Best, Barron Trump. Emily sat frozen for a moment, the weight of the letter sinking in. She had never expected an apology or even an acknowledgement from Barron, much less a thank you. She realized, reading his words, that his response had gone beyond the public sphere. It had touched something within him, something personal. And now, it had come full circle. The letter marked a moment of profound change for Emily. It was as if Barron had silently allowed her to redeem herself in a way she hadn't even realized she needed. She kept the letter in a frame, a reminder not only of her own journey but of the quiet power of vulnerability and growth. A few years later, when Emily was invited to speak at another major panel, this time focused on the ethics of reporting on public figures and their families, she reflected on Barron's impact once again. During the discussion, she spoke openly about the role of public perception and the dangers of quick judgments. She shared her own experience, how she had been part of a narrative that had attempted to define someone before truly understanding them. She didn't name Barron, but those in the room could sense the transformation in her words. But perhaps the most significant change was that, years after that pivotal moment, Barron Trump himself had begun making more public appearances. Not in the way his father did, not seeking the spotlight or creating headlines for controversy. Instead, Barron chose to speak on topics like education, the importance of understanding diverse perspectives, and advocating for a more inclusive political discourse. He became a figure of quiet strength, using his voice not for the drama that so often followed the Trump family but for a message of personal growth and resilience. And so, the cycle continued. One small act of defiance had sparked a change in one journalist, but it had also ignited a broader conversation about how we engage with those in the public eye. Barron Trump, the quiet young man who had once been reduced to a punchline in the media, had quietly reshaped the way people thought about public figures, responsibility, and the complex nature of identity. Years from now, when people reflected on Barron Trump, it wouldn't be his father's shadow they saw, but his own steady presence. And in the end, Barron had achieved something that few expected. He had defined himself on his own terms. It had been years since that fateful press conference where Barron Trump had stood up to Emily Hartford, and the landscape had shifted dramatically. What had started as an unexpected exchange of words between a journalist and a young man from a well-known family had rippled out into a broader conversation about responsibility, growth, and the impact of the media. But what had transpired since then was not just a shift in how Barron was perceived, it was a revolution in how journalists and the public approached the stories of those in the limelight. Emily had changed. She had found a new path, a deeper sense of purpose in her work. The harsh, biting commentary that had once defined her writing had softened, replaced by pieces that carried nuance, empathy, and a true desire to understand the people she wrote about. She had spoken about the importance of ethical journalism at various conferences, sharing her own transformation and the lessons she had learned from Barron. She had come to realize that her words could shape not just the stories she told but the world around her. Meanwhile, Barron Trump had continued on his path. After quietly stepping into the public eye more frequently, he had slowly earned the respect of those who had once written him off as just another product of his father's legacy. He became a champion of causes that mattered to him, advocating for education reform, environmental awareness, and mental health initiatives. His voice, once drowned out by the cacophony of political headlines, now carried weight, and people listened. One evening, Emily sat down to write her final article. It wasn't a story about Barron, nor was it another reflection on her own career. It was about the power of moments, the moments that shaped us, even when we didn't know they were happening. She wrote about the times when words, simple words, had the ability to shift the course of someone's life, to challenge their perception of who they could be and what they could stand for. Her last piece was titled The Power of Silence and Words, A Journey of Transformation. In it, she reflected on how Barron Trump's brief, quiet response to her sharp criticism had not only altered the course of her career but had sparked a change in how the media treated public figures and their families. It wasn't just the political narrative that had shifted, it was the human narrative, the recognition that everyone had a story to tell, and that story was theirs to control. She ended the article with these words: "In this world of constant noise, it's the moments of quiet strength that leave the most lasting impressions." Barron Trump, once a figure surrounded by controversy, taught me a lesson that few journalists learn, that the truth isn't always loud, and growth isn't always immediate. Sometimes, it's the small moments, the ones that seem insignificant at the time, that shape our futures in ways we never imagined. As for Barron, he's no longer just the son of Donald Trump. He is, simply, Barron Trump. And in the end, he has defined himself on his own terms, just as we all must. With those final words, Emily Hartford submitted her article. It felt like a conclusion, a closing chapter to a story that had started with a public spat and evolved into something far more meaningful. And as for Barron, he continued to live his life, under the radar but undeniably his own. He had been through the fire, had been shaped by public opinion, but he had never let it define him. He had become a man whose quiet resilience had spoken louder than any headline ever could. In the end, the story wasn't just about Barron or Emily. It was about the power of understanding, the importance of change, and the quiet strength that can come when we allow ourselves the space to grow.